Great. Well, thank you all for coming. Science and Data Committee for October 27th. And so on the agenda today, we'll review the minutes briefly from the meeting a couple of weeks ago, and then we have a number of updates and items to talk about, including the documents presented to the Climate Council yesterday. We'll have a status and update of the monitoring and assessment task group, hopefully discuss a bit the greenhouse gas inventory, the supplemental analysis RFI, including the timing and process for that, and a brief update on the sensitivity analyses that will be going into the modeling, and then talk about the carbon budget that the Ag and Ecosystems Subcommittee presented yesterday to the full council, and then any miscellaneous items. Hopefully, if we're not too far ahead of schedule, Leslie Ann will be able to join by 2:30, and in that slot provide an update on her and Jay's drafting of the climate impact sections of the CAP. Any additions or changes to the agenda? Seeing none, we can go forward. And I know, first of all, I should have done this first, but I apologize for not sending out the agenda until this morning, and we'll try not to let that happen again. I thought I had sent it last night, but that also was not soon enough. So we'll try and do better and get these out sooner for you all. I'm not sure if anybody has had a chance to review the minutes. I did put a link in the chat as well. Looks like Jared at least has reviewed the minutes. Are there any objections or to the minutes, or speak now if you would like more time?
Do you say which they are, which date? Just
oh, sorry, the October 13th minutes.
Thanks.
Okay, hearing no objections or requests for more time, we'll consider those minutes approved. And we can go straight to the next agenda item. So update on the documents presented to the Climate Council. I'll speak to the social cost of carbon and the cost of carbon model review. We had good feedback and lots of thanks for the work that we did. I think but we did get some feedback, and there's two main pieces of feedback. One, there was just an addition to spell out a little more kind of understanding of the really what the social cost of carbon represents and how it might be used in the plan. And two is really just to remove all the jargon from the document. And so and it's what I said yesterday as well, is that when I looked at it and reviewed it with you all here, I thought it looked good in that regard. And then upon getting some comments and feedback, the feedback was absolutely correct that there was a lot of jargon in it. And so,
TJ, I would just offer that what I heard is add more plain language, not remove the jargon, because my worry is that if we remove some of the language, that even though it sounds technical and jargony, it actually means something. And I do think that's a challenge, I think, with scientific and technical writing, that we want to be precise and that certain technical terms mean something and they need to be in there. So I would be really hesitant to kind of take terms out. I think if there are places that up front or at the end of a paragraph, we can summarize something in more plain language, that's good to add. But I think I'd be much more comfortable kind of saying, yes, please go ahead and add some plain language rather than taking out anything that we've already agreed to.
Yeah, thank you, Jared. I really probably mischaracterized that in the summary here. So I think that is really the intent behind the comments as well. So,
and I meant to say that yesterday at the council meeting. We just we're running short on time. So,
and there's things like discount rate is jargon, right? But you
means
can't,
something. It's
yeah,
important.
you can't remove the words discount rate completely. So the next steps on that, as I understand it, and Jane, just interrupt and correct me if I go wrong here, is that we will, I will send a new draft around. I'm happy to send that to folks here to the extent that you're interested and want to see it. But it needs to go to the full council. But the council approved the substance of the recommendations. So they're not going to take it up in a, in a specific agenda item again in a council meeting, but rather they will see it in the draft of the climate action plan. And there is an opportunity if somebody wants to bring something up again there. But for now, at least, as I understand it, it is approved to, with those changes that they recommended, adding more plain language, a little more explanation, that it will be in the final climate action plan.
And the other piece, just to put a finer point on it, that was requested that aligns with what our recommendation was all along and what we discussed, was that when the discount rates are presented, that the modeling includes sensitivity analysis as New York is doing, and their recommendation at the 1% and 3% levels as well. Because right now, I think it just reads something like 2% is a reasonable discount rate to use, and kind of that's going to be our central value. But there was a request from a couple of people, which I think is totally aligned with where we were before, to explicitly note that we want to see sensitivities run at the 1% and 3% levels as well.
Right. Any comments or questions about that document? Okay, hearing none. Jared, do you want to talk about the greenhouse gas inventory document and then the proportional reductions?
Sure, and there was a very short document that was just like an introductory paragraph for that section that I actually don't believe this subcommittee saw, but it basically just established our commitment as a council to incorporating and following the latest available and highest quality data and analysis and peer-reviewed science, and that that has been infused into our process as a council as a whole, and that was the rationale for creating the science and data subcommittee to be in the service of the other subcommittees, even though it was not kind of required by statute. So it was really just that kind of introductory paragraph, context setting piece that was approved without any changes. And similarly, the greenhouse gas recommendations are the same ones that we all have looked at multiple times, and happy to say those were also approved by the council without any changes. But I'm happy to pause on either of those topics or documents if folks want to get into them. Otherwise, I'm happy to give an overview of the discussions around reference year for sectoral proportionality and how we weigh different objectives for the climate action plan. Okay, so after our last meeting, which those of you who saw the notes will remember that we affirmed a consensus on this committee that 2018 made sense as a reference year in terms of looking at emissions by sector as it being the latest data that we have available since the GWSA was passed. So then I joined a group including Commissioner Walk from DEC and Rich Cowart, the two co-chairs of cross-sector mitigation subcommittee, along with Ryan Patch from Ag and Ecosystems, and then some great staff support from Colin Smith and Megan O'Toole from A&R, and kind of we wrote up a recommendation that basically just codified that understanding of recommending 2018 as the reference year for sectoral proportionality, and then also kind of affirmatively saying that when and if those 8 different objectives in 10 BSA 592 section D, it's not always going to be possible to meet all 8 of those objectives, and sometimes they may be in conflict, that it's our understanding that we need to use our best judgment, and that there may be circumstances in which we should not hold a sector strictly responsible to meeting its proportional share of reductions if there are not, for instance, cost-effective, technologically feasible, or equitable emissions reduction pathways available to them compared to other sectors where there may be more opportunity. So very consistent with our conversation last committee meeting. Thankfully, that group of folks from across subcommittees achieved consensus, and then we presented that. Peter and I presented those recommendations yesterday at the council, and those were also approved. So I imagine that will get referenced in the climate action plan in a couple of places where it's really helpful to clarify what our understanding is of what we're looking for from each sector, and also the limitations of just taking a sector by sector look. Anything I missed, Jane?
I'll just point out that we keep getting public comment on the same point, on that, hey, in the document that you shared yesterday, Jared, and that was shared with this committee before,
Yep.
that electric emissions is 2%, and then we keep getting this comment on, well, that's really understating the contribution from the electric sector and the impact of electric emissions. And I got it today. I needed to present for 10 minutes on at the Vermont System Planning Committee, and the same comment came up again. And I share that. I want to share that just to I feel like we need to just be ultra clear in communicating the greenhouse gas inventory in general, and what it does and doesn't do, and what the supplemental analyses will and won't do. And just to, we'll get into in a minute, but to also, share the understanding of the sensitivities that are going to be run on the model. I think the comment is really from just saying it's from folks who are really concerned that we're not appropriately accounting for the upstream and life cycle emissions of certain energy sources. I think that this committee has been pretty clear. I think the report that we forwarded has been clear, but I just wanted to let folks know that this issue is coming up, and I don't know if there's other ways that we can communicate clearly.
Yeah, and I would just note briefly that at the end of the meeting, I tried to reassure folks that even though kind of there was a reference to the existing inventory and the kind of emissions that it assigns by sector, there was no recommendation in that letter about changing the kind of sectoral proportionality kind of reference your question, and then the different objectives in the Global Warming Solutions Act. There was no recommendation put forward about kind of establishing or changing a methodology. It was referencing the inventory that already exists. At the same time, we have committed as a group, and we've got later on the agenda, to a process by which we can gather more information to look at upstream and life cycle emissions from different energy sources, not just in the electricity sector. It is important that we are consistent across the board on that. So, but of course, there is not time before this first cap goes to press to do a new inventory or to have a change in methodology. I will just say that in terms of it would be fair to say if we think we're missing something big, should we be aware of that? And I'll just reiterate, that speaking for myself personally, I am committed to and think it's important that we have transparency and accuracy around sources, looking at not just site energy sources at the facility level, but also having eyes on what can be transparently, accurately characterized for upstream or life cycle emissions. But an EAN senior fellow, Lee Seddon, has looked into this question of, and this would overstate the impact of life cycle emissions because it would be kind of an apples to oranges comparison. But he did an analysis looking at, if you take the most recent peer-reviewed numbers for life cycle emissions from electricity sources and just add them in, replace them, use those instead of the site level or facility level emissions factors for hydro and nuclear, it would take our electricity sector emissions from 2% of our total to 2.25% of our total. And that doesn't even change, that doesn't even look at what you would also need to do at the same time to have an apples to apples comparison, which would be a life cycle analysis of all of the fossil fuels that are used in the transportation and thermal sectors and also in the electricity sector from the ISO New England grid mix. I think that the number one impact of doing a life cycle analysis is likely to be, from the research I've done, it's likely to be an increased emissions factor, most of all for natural gas. And, if you talk to transmission folks, I've asked, I don't know if Lou is on, I think he is, I'll just say, I've asked Velco, what happens if Vermont were to purchase less Hydro-Quebec electricity? And what I hear from transmission folks and utilities is that the value of hydro is that it's a firm power resource to balance out our load, especially when there's the other renewable sources or low carbon sources are intermittent. So, over the last decade, if we hadn't been using, Hydro-Quebec or even going forward, I think in the long term, I'm really hopeful about opportunities around solar plus storage and both utility scale and residential scale storage and kind of load management techniques so that the intermittency issues aren't as problematic as they are now. But when I ask transmission folks what the options are for firm power resources, it's basically hydro, nuclear, or natural gas. And I don't think we want to be in a situation where we're saying that we should treat something differently such that it leads to what would be a major increase in emissions if we were swapping out hydro for natural gas. I'm not suggesting that that's what people are saying, but I think we need to be really clear about what the real alternatives are in different situations as we also assess both site level and life cycle emissions factors. So yeah, I think the conversation is really important to continue, but if any way you look at the numbers, any way you count these things, the vast majority of our pollution is coming from the fossil fuels that are used in our transportation and thermal sectors, and within the electricity sector, it's the residual grid mix fossil fuel use from natural gas.
Thanks, Jared. I appreciate you addressing that here because it does continue to come up, and I think it's important to continue to ensure that we all have the same kind of basic understanding, but just within this committee, but then also to be able to communicate that. Lou.
Yeah, I just want to echo Jared's comments. I think it's well put, and it's very important to remember that for every megawatt of generation that is reduced of one kind, the marginal unit is increased. The marginal unit in New England is almost all the time natural gas. So that doesn't necessarily take into account, REC purchases and a utilities portfolio may be, kind of counted up after the fact to be more renewable than the system was at any given time. But the real impact is actual, fossil fuel generation being increased. And there was another thought in my mind. And maybe this is not, incredibly germane to the discussion, but I just wanted to talk about a little bit about load flexibility and base load generation. It's very likely that in the future, we'll be able to utilize load flexibility to reduce the effects of intermittency on the requirements of base load generation as opposed to renewable intermittent generation. But given that a lot of renewable generation is going to be located in the same place, the intermittency issues that affect that large scale, the large deployment of those renewable resources is going to be even more dramatic. So for example, offshore wind, those plants are expected to perform similarly. A lot of the onshore wind in New England will perform similarly to the other plants. And it's been seen that there's a high correlation of solar production across New England, such that if one of these resources goes away, it's going to hit the system. And so load flexibility can help you there, but there's still a need for base load generation. The specifics, we'll work out, as we learn more over the coming decades. But that we'll always have a need for base load generation of some kind or another, and what form that takes, that's part of our job to figure out over the coming years.
Thanks, Lou. Agree with you completely. Richard.
Yeah, hi, good afternoon. I agree 98% with both Jared and Lou. I just want to make the observation that the kind of analysis that Jared was talking about that shows a 1/8 increase in the greenhouse gas generation for electricity if you account for certain externalities. The importance of that is, of demonstrating that, is to demonstrate that it's small. So it's worth doing the analysis, even if you think the result is going to be that it's a trivially small result, because that documents that you looked and that it's really, and that you know how big it is.
Absolutely. I don't know if we have time for it here, but there is also a distinction between kind of the short run marginal generator that we're talking about and then long run marginal generators that are part of a utility portfolio of resources. And I think those differences get lost in the shuffle, and it can get really technical really quickly. But part of that is the way I try and explain it to get to your point in the chat, Richard, is that you flip on a light switch and turn it off, and that's the short run marginal generator is meeting that load or turning off. But in the long run, over a year, over several years, we're looking at kind of the renewability based on the purchases and the attributes of those purchases. Those renewable energy credits and how we count in the inventory, at least now, are recognizing that those renewable energy credits are a revenue stream that is intending to cause that additionality. It's paying for the difference in the current energy price and what a renewable generator needs to be built. And so at least that's the theory of it. I think that you could argue there's arguments in any given time whether that's happening in practice, but there's a distinction there and a lot of issues to tease out, and I don't think we'll get into it too much today, but it's worth kind of noting and having that be part of the discussion, again, for the purpose of really just having a base understanding of all these different kind of avenues of way to look at it and information to have that honest debate of the issues. Okay, so apologies, we kind of got off the agenda, although we have you here till 4, so I took a little prerogative to dive into that. So next up on the agenda is the monitoring and assessment task group and an update. And I'm going to be honest here. I'm not sure where we're at here. I'm not sure if Jared or Jane maybe have an update here that could share. But my goal is to not only have an update, but to help guide that task group to next steps if possible.
Jane, do you want to kick that out?
Yeah. I met with Cadmus and ESG this morning and had hoped that they would have an updated memo based on our conversation last week that Jared and Richard and I had, along with others, to advance the work of the measurement and progress task group, but they don't yet. And we have a meeting scheduled for next Thursday to review the final framework that they're proposing for how we would then include it in the CAP and think about how we reference the work to date. I think at that meeting, we're also thinking about having both Emily Bird has offered to come and speak to us about the tool for the clean water work, as well as May Butler to speak to the work that EAN has done with the dashboard and other tools. And so I will say that we came to an agreement on the goals of the tool, and there was some more refinement needed based on that conversation to carry the work forward. But we're really thinking about putting forward a tool that will be developed after December 1st, but laying the groundwork for the framework of how that tool is built beyond December 1st in the climate action plan for the intent of having everybody to agree to that framework in the plan. And if you want to speak a little bit more detailed, Jared and Richard, about your takeaways from that meeting, I was actually hoping to pull up, before we got to this on the agenda, to pull up the goals to drop in the chat. That would hopefully help guide the conversation too, and I could do that.
I have nothing to add.
I thought that was a good summary.
Perfect.
I'll just say that to buy you another couple of seconds to drop those goals in the chat, which I think would be helpful to see. And I think, if we can share that memo from Cadmus and the EFG once it is ready, and then we can kind of add that to a future agenda once folks have had a chance to look at that. I think that sounds like a great next step.
So you said that the next meeting of that group is not till next week, Thursday, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of a framework going forward, is there a sense of kind of the types of actions? I just want to make sure that we have enough time as a subcommittee to kind of vet this and then give it to the full council as a recommendation, and the time is getting short, but and I apologize if I missed this, but is there specific things like continue to use the LEAP modeling tool or a monitoring and assessment tool to track progress, or is it higher level framework of here are the data gaps that are missing and here's what we need to do to meet them, and not quite so specific?
We talked about clarifying the sort of roles and responsibilities of all the tools that we're sort of putting forward. So the LEAP modeling, the greenhouse gas inventory as sort of the foundational work, and then that they all need to be able to speak to each other and direct the work, but that this would really be intended to ultimately be a more real-time policy lever indicator to show how we're doing, mindful of the LEAP modeling that can also be happening, and the greenhouse gas inventory that will be a number of years sort of behind the actual progress on the ground. I'm realizing and I want Julie to go ahead and answer a question, but I hope Liz was supposed to send me the final goals after our meeting this morning, and because I don't actually have the memo, she just shared it as a working document at our meeting last week, and then was taking it back to work on it more. And as far as the timeline, TJ, that's really mindful. The role of the subcommittee, I think I need to look at how we continue to meet as a task group, and then how we fold it in to the larger subcommittee's approval before bringing it to the council. And I can't remember if this goes to the council on the 9th or the 16th. So while Julie asks her question, I can look at that too, just to make sure that there's another meeting between now and then to look at that. And if there isn't, I don't see why based on the input that we had last week from the group, it was a really productive meeting on that framework. Rather than like meeting as a group next Thursday, we could invite Liz as on behalf of the Cadmus and EFG team working on it to present the final framework just to the science and data meeting. And we as a group can decide if we want to dive deeper into sort of advancing the tool, which is what I think we're doing when we're inviting people like Emily and May to give us some samples. That might be left to the task group to work on after, but maybe we could use this meeting the next time you meet, if next week, to actually dive into the framework to get your approval of the direction that we're taking. Julie?
Yeah, I think if it's ready, that might be a good use of time next week. Julie,
Yes.
you go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna less a question and more a comment, and sort of adding to much of what Jane said is I think this monitoring and assessment task needs to be not only for the greenhouse gas emissions reduction piece, but also thinking about the adaptation and resilience pieces and sort of what goals we've established and how we will track that progress over time. And just want to make sure that we sort of keep that as part of the mix. I know to my mind, the greenhouse gas emissions inventory, obviously my background's in water, looks a lot like our long-term monitoring program for Lake Champlain, where it's able to detect fairly significant trends over a period of significant time. In the case of Lake Champlain, it's plus or minus 15% over 5 years. It means it doesn't give us a lot of information on a year-over-year basis in terms of compliance. And there's some need to check individual practices and make sure they're performing the way we expect them to perform, but also then just to essentially do the widget or bean counting and measure our progress in terms of actual actions achieved. And I think the LEAP model is obviously a really important component of that long-term mix along with the inventory, but then also think we'll be well served ultimately to think about a little bit more work to do some on the ground specifics around some of these practices and ensure we're having the desired effect, particularly when it comes to, I think, some of what I, in my mind, refer to as readiness practices, right? Like some of the grid resiliency pieces, some of the home electrification pieces that have to get done in order to ultimately get the greenhouse gas emissions reductions, but aren't going to necessarily show up in a greenhouse gas emissions reduction model. And I think it'll be really important for us to be able to both set goals and show progress in those spaces as we move forward. Otherwise, those investments will get short shrift because they won't actually produce the emissions reductions directly. So that was a lot of brain dump there. I can make it better organized, but just wanted to put those ideas out.
Yeah, thanks. Just to your first point around the fact that what this tool is tracking, we as a group have talked a lot about it being first and foremost a tool to track emissions reductions and the progress in that space, but recognizing the ability to also speak to resilience and adaptation and other progress. And so that's explicitly spelled out as a goal to recognize that right now we're thinking around the emissions reductions piece, but wanting to build a tool that is adaptable, if possible, to speak to the broader work of the climate action plan and actions specifically, and thinking about how we think about the right data to actually include in the long term to do that, but right now don't have the right data to actually set that up. So it's going to be kind of narrowly focused out of the gate around emissions reductions and the policies impacting those.
I think we would be well served to make sure we're clearly articulating kind of the ultimate and not just that's the be all end all of what falls under the heading of monitoring and assessment.
Great, thanks. Richard, go ahead.
Yeah, I've said this before, so I'll be really succinct. it's really important to be able to draw a line between the activities that are supported under this program area and the desired outcomes, and to be able to specify what the intermediate outcomes are between what you do with your staff and your money every day and the desired eventual goal, whether it's a resilience goal or a greenhouse gas emission goal. If you can specify the intermediate steps between what you're doing and what you expect the ultimate outcome to be, then you have the opportunity to monitor your progress on those intermediate steps in confidence that they will result eventually in the desired outcome.
Thanks, Richard. Jared, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to note, following up on what Secretary Moore was saying, is that, you know, when we started the meeting, I think in both meetings we've had a key reference point for us has been 591 section B3 that speaks, there's 4 things, A, B, C, and D, about what we're directed to identify the means to accurately measure. The first ones relate to emissions reduction. And the third is C is the effect of climate change on the state's climate, wildlife, and natural resources, and D relates more to resilience and adaptation. And, you know, I think one of the questions that we had was for C, that kind of effect of climate change on the state's climate, wildlife, and natural resources. Our kind of hypothesis was that that's been a primary focus and purpose of the Vermont climate assessment. And so probably does not make sense to be redundant or kind of reinvent the wheel there if that on a regular basis can be the means by which that is being tracked. I do think there are some outstanding questions about how we measure, which relates to what are the goals, both quantitative and qualitative, on the resilience of the state's communities, infrastructure, and economy. And I'm reading from D right now, and progress towards improving resilience to adapt to the current and anticipated effects of climate change. I feel like to have the monitoring and assessment tool, we need greater clarity on the goals there and what we're tracking towards. For A and B in that section, which are really about publishing emissions data in a timely manner and being able to assess the effectiveness of the specific initiatives, programs, and strategies set forth in the climate action plan and any updates to the plan with regard to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, I think that the group was really clear that we recognize that that we need a faster, kind of more real-time way to have eyes on the, as Richard was suggesting, the potential effects of our plan and the programs and the policies, that doesn't just wait for the full inventory, which is oftentimes, you know, 2 or 3 years delayed. And so what can we do? What can we set up in terms of monitoring and assessment to really track some of the key measures that we know, or that we have, that we presume that the plan is built around, lead to emissions reduction? And that's a lot of what we've done with the Vermont Energy Dashboard, is tracking the number of comprehensive home retrofits for weatherization and fuel use reduction, tracking and posting the number of, you know, thanks to the great data being provided by Efficiency Vermont, you know, the number of heat pump installations, the number from DMV of electric vehicle registrations. The more that we can have real-time data to have a sense of whether we're on or off track, so that we can adjust targets or recommendations proactively rather than kind of reactively 3 years later, I think is really important for the plan to be effective in real time. And I think that'll be a key goal of this group.
That's great, Jared. That was one of the reasons I raised my hand, because I wanted to comment on that specifically. And Julie, you mentioned kind of the water context of, you know, plus or minus 15% in 5 years. I don't know if well, I don't know anything about the water context, but I know that the expectation, I think, rightly or wrongly, is for kind of updated, more real-time measurement of the progress towards our goals. And that's been set up in our energy plan. We have to do an annual energy report, which I think is a great requirement. When I say have to do it, it's really good because it does update us on kind of where we are on our, building retrofit targets, on our electric vehicle targets. But then we do point back to the inventory, for instance, as well, which is delayed. And so that real-time information is important.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, the water piece is unique or different from air in that sort of the watershed is fairly well defined and understood, as opposed to our airshed, which is a lot bigger and more complex. And the reason for the plus or minus 15% over 5 years is because it's almost all of our phosphorus pollution is driven by wet weather, and weather is noisy. And so it's hard to detect those trends. That said, it's also an important sort of expectations management tool on the part of the public. And I think that's a piece that ultimately we're going to have to wrestle with too, not prior to December 1st, but it's, people want to say, okay, I put $1 in and I got this many pounds of phosphorus. Or I put $1 in and I got this many tons of CO2 equivalents. And somehow just the math isn't perfect. And that we're not going to, and I think in the case of greenhouse gas emissions, it's that we can't even really measure Vermont's component of it. It's all modeling. And just making sure we've set public expectations appropriately, that we are doing all of these really important measures. We know each one of them does have value in terms of greenhouse gas emissions reductions. We can aggregate them. There's nowhere we can go and collect a sample to actually prove that we've had the intended effect. And in fact, based on the decisions of others, not in Vermont, global or even regional CO2 levels may continue to climb upwards. And somehow there's a communications piece in addition to a tracking progress piece that's going to be really important. And it's one I don't think we spent enough time in the water space kind of plotting out ahead of time. And we're sort of often back on our heels then trying to explain what the value of our investments when it isn't yielding those direct measurable year over year impacts in water quality.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the analogies are pretty right on, or the parallels are there. I mean, I think of weather impacts to the thermal sector. We need to be careful to not claim victory or admit defeat just because we had a really warm winter or a really cold winter one year. And just it's really, a lot of that is in the framing of how we present the data and communicate what a single data point means.
Yeah, and the more thoughtful we can be about that up front, I think the better off it serves us in the long run.
And well, it sounds like this task group is thinking about that, which is good. The other question I had was, is there, to your point, Julie, is there anybody from the Rural Resilience Committee on the task group? I can't remember. I should know this, but I don't. And if not, should we reach out and connect?
That's a good idea. Yeah, there is not anybody right now, but we can do that.
So I think to the extent that if folks agree, I think if this subcommittee could just give that guidance to the task group to please invite somebody, and whether it's to our next meeting, it sounds like maybe, if it works in the schedules and we can do it, next Wednesday to really go over this. But I think it seems like there maybe should be a little bit of engagement prior to that as well, so that it's not just like, here, we're presenting the end product and inviting you to the subcommittee meeting.
I can, there are emails flying right now about Friday's rural resilience agenda, so we can add it to the agenda. We can update them a bit on it.
Right. Thank you, Jane. Okay.
But just a comment, and this is probably not for you all necessarily, but just a comment around the Vermont climate assessment. We are, and that is due to have a public press release, and I think it's like the second week of November. And we'll very much want to be thinking about how we coordinate the rollout of the climate action plan and the climate assessment, and continue to speak to the two documents and the benefit of both. And it is great actually to be able to point to the support that we're relying on from the BCA to help us with monitoring and assessing progress in some of our obligations.
Right. Thanks, Jane. Okay, so I think the next on the agenda is the inventory supplemental analysis. Start with the RFI timing and process. So if, well, Jared, just jump in anytime you want, but I think the timing of well, everybody will recall that our recommendations were to issue an RFI to get more information about upstream and supplemental analysis and what it might take, and kind of the best avenues to do that. In drafting the RFI, as I understand it, it's just the climate action plan itself is really taking all staff resources, and frankly, I'm trying to steal some for part of the energy plan from some of the same people that are working on this type of issue. So I know there's others that can give a lot more color to that, but to my knowledge, that the real heavy lifting hasn't really gone on yet.
Yeah, I would defer to Jane or Julie. My sense is that there have been conversations within ANR about a drafting process for that. I don't know if there's an update ready to share, but if there is, then it'd be great to start with that.
If an update on process means that I talked to Megan about, in Megan's new role, being able to support the initial drafting of the RFI, I have done that, and hopefully I see Megan here, so not saying anything that she hasn't committed to, but I know that Megan and also Colin, with his expertise, are committed once we get through this initial cap drafting to support the initial drafting of the RFI.
And I'll just note that Megan and Colin, I'm happy to engage with you anytime that may be helpful on some of that. I do think that up front, one of the things I would really hope that we clearly raise the question about in the RFI is different definitions and ways to kind of interpret and apply the guidance around emissions caused, I can't remember the exact language, but it's something like emissions caused by the use of energy within Vermont, whether those emissions occur in Vermont or outside of the state borders. Because I think that, some places you see the term upstream, sometimes you see the term life cycle. And I think that one of the things we need to make sure we're really clear about is definitions of those terms, and then options based on different definitions for how to interpret and then go about doing that analysis. And I do think that there'll be some distinctions by sector. So we're talking upstream or life cycle analysis related to Vermont's energy use. I think it's much more straightforward to apply LCA life cycle factors, that have been developed by Argonne National Labs and the GREET model, that have been used by states like California, Washington, and Oregon for their low carbon fuel standard, for kind of fuels, both fossil and bio, used for purposes of transportation and thermal. That's kind of a really well-established peer-reviewed literature. I think it becomes more complicated, the question of definitions and interpretation with regard to the electricity sector, especially given kind of the interconnection between the ISO New England grid and Quebec and questions about REC accounting. I think that needs to be done very transparently and very carefully. And in my sense, I could be wrong, is that there is not as much that has been done in those areas, or it's a more contested space than the kind of upstream or life cycle emissions factors with relation to transportation and thermal fuels. So I hope that the RFI can help us surface some of the options for how we do that upstream or life cycle accounting on the electricity side as well.
I just also wanted to mention really briefly that Colin and I are participating in another group that is investigating consumption-based emissions inventory, and it's a multi-state effort that EPA is engaging with. Mostly staff from EPA Region 1 is engaging with those states on, and so I think that's going to be a parallel effort that will hopefully also inform the RFI and the continued work in what I'm sure is going to be, you know, a lengthy investigation into how we want to go about that.
Great. Thank you both. I also did want to just mention the sensitivities that are being done in the modeling. There's, as I understand it, there's 4 sensitivities that are being done. The first one I don't really see as a sensitivity. It is a sensitivity in one way, but it's not really to the emissions modeling. It's the social cost of carbon sensitivities to the discount rate, which is kind of after you determine the amount of emissions, then, you know, here's the range of values that you assign to it. But that is an analysis that is going to be done. We mentioned earlier the emissions for large hydro, and then emissions from biofuels. And I was hoping that I would have the actual numbers for those last 2 that are the range of sensitivity for today. I had an exchange with EFG this morning. The modeling is going to be done by the end of the week, but I didn't actually get the numbers that we're using, so that they've ultimately used. So I don't know what they are today. I'm not sure if Jared, you have insight into that or not.
I don't know.
But the recommendations that Richard, you put forward, and then discussion with Ali, they've been shared. So hopefully they're in that range. And then the last sensitivity is a population sensitivity. We've talked a lot about in this committee, mainly over the summer, and not so much recently, but about the potential for, you know, climate migration and a change in climate, change in population, and what that might do to our targets and, you know, our energy use, and so and the need for greater emissions reduction strategies. So a larger population shift is being modeled also.
Just a clarifying question, TJ, on that third sensitivity. When you say biofuels, is that biomass and liquid? Is it solid and liquid biofuels, or is it just the kind of wood component, kind of solid biomass component that Richard was requesting?
So I'll just read this sentence. It's a sensitivity that reports on the biogenic emissions from biomass and biofuels combustion. That's about as detailed as I can get.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah.
As long as they're done separately and not together.
Right. That I think they couldn't be the same value. Is that what you're saying, Richard?
Well, the sensitivity analysis. I was hoping for a sensitivity analysis of very different values for the GWP bio in the range of 0 to 0.5. Mm-hmm. And if they also want to do sensitivity analyses for what happens when you burn biodiesel? That's great, but that's a separate question.
Right. I'll confirm that. I'll send a message and confirm that. I don't know the answer. Like I said, I was reading that portion of the email.
No, I got it, but
I will. I understand your point, and it'll be you're not isolating that if you're doing both. So.
And TJ, did they confirm that the social cost of carbon sensitivities would have the discount rates run at the 1%, 2%, and 3% level?
It doesn't say that in
I
this.
haven't heard David say that. Yeah, I was going to say.
It'd be good to confirm that if.
Yeah. Will do, and we'll report back on both of those next week. Sorry, I'm looking at a bigger screen now, so I don't have to lean so far in towards the small monitor. So I feel it's strange for me to see myself looking off into the distance, but
You look more relaxed sitting back.
it's much
in your
better
chair.
on my eyes. Yeah, well, my face isn't covering the whole box, the square. So, okay, great. So next on the agenda is just an update on the carbon budget. It was presented to the full council yesterday. I'm gonna put either Jared or Jane on the spot again to talk about this. If either of you are willing to provide a brief summary.
Yeah, while I'm talking, I'll also try to find that if folks haven't seen the recommendations that were put forward by Ag and Eco yesterday, as well as and adopted by the council yesterday. I'll drop those in the chat right now. Hold on. But they were the focus around the recommendations as presented to the council were largely focused on three things: the RFI that you all, or in this case, actually likely an RFP that would be advanced in the space as a recommendation to further refine and consider the land use sector in the overlap between that with the greenhouse gas inventory. So that's one recommendation. The second is really around clarifying and cleaning up some of the data components that are in the carbon budget itself for further future work, because there's also a recommendation to continue to replicate the carbon budget on a recurring basis, likely every year. And then finally, there's a recommendation around future carbon forecasting. And this is the component of the work that we've explored for a while with Jonathan Thompson, who works from Harvard, who did some work for Maine, looking at the projections of not dissimilar from what we're doing with emissions, but in this case, thinking about the policy levers we have to pull and to enhance our sequestration and carbon storage over time, and thinking about what business as usual would get us versus what we could do to enhance sequestration. And so those were largely the recommendations, but broad brush stroke, and they were approved by the council yesterday. And I dropped them in the chat, and please clarify anything I got mischaracterized or got a little wrong.
Great, thanks, Jane. Any questions from the subcommittee on the carbon budget?
I'll just note that, like, as we discussed, I know Julie expressed this view at a previous subcommittee meeting, and I also wanted to bring it up at the full council meeting yesterday, is that as we go forward with that RFP, I think it is really important that we have engagement from folks in both the science and data and the ag and ecosystems subcommittee, because I think that we ran into some kind of challenges around communication when all the folks working on the carbon budget were a different group than all the folks working on the GHG inventory review. And I think it is important to be consistent. Like, my understanding of that RFI is that it's going to look for opportunities for how we can improve the accuracy and of both gross agricultural sector emissions, which is really relevant to the GHG inventory, as well as sinks in terms of storage and sequestration, that will be really relevant for the carbon budget. And we want to have kind of eyes on both. And so that was just, I think that also leads to, like, you know, a question that eventually will need to be raised and answered, which is, and I don't think it is a priority pre-December 1st for sure, but I do think that it'd be good to get clarity on the process for designing and issuing that RFP and who is involved. I mean, I think I would hope that it's A&R, given the kind of overall role that A&R is playing in terms of staffing the Climate Council, but that it would include folks who've been involved in the GHG task group, the carbon budget task group, and from the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee and the Agency of Ag, to make sure that those conversations are kind of open and aligned.
So one thing that's been in the back of my mind, and it may speak to that kind of coordination that you were talking about, Jared, is that we really, this committee should really start to think about other folks who could contribute and be on the committee. I think we should try and expand our number so that there's more of us able to participate fully on these task groups. And a lot of us are pulling like triple and quadruple duty in places. And so we don't have to talk about it today, but I just want to throw it out there to have it in the back of folks' mind. I think realistically, we're talking for a starting after the draft of the climate action plan is out. It maybe not, though, if somebody really wanted to jump in, but I think we could use some help and some more expertise to help us, further our mission going forward.
I just want to say that there are a lot of further technical analyses that are going to be needed after December 1st. And so, like, moving forward with an RFI is not committing us to any of that, but moving forward with an RFP is. And so Julie and I, in our context and understanding, is that after the climate action plan is adopted on December 1st, the council is going to have to review and consider all of the further technical analysis needs together. And that includes the recommendation to pursue an RFP in this space. There's two RFPs, as I see here, or two potential contracts. There's the RFP to further inform the inventory around the land use sector. But then there's also the contract that we're talking about potentially with Jonathan Thompson to do carbon forecasting. There's also a whole slew of other considerations for technical analysis, like further economic modeling, what the RFI for life cycle upstream analysis would also lead to an RFP, and so on, a VMT study for smart growth. And so we're going to have to be thinking about all of these actions and against each other, and thinking about which ones are prioritized to explore through contractual services after December 1st. So I just want to say that while we can move forward with the RFI, I don't think we'll be moving forward with any of these contracts or RFPs until after December 1st.
Makes sense.
Thanks, Jan. Okay, if there's no other questions on the carbon budget, one of the miscellaneous items, like I mentioned earlier, would just be an update on the progress of the climate impact, and then really the foundation for the climate action plan, but the drafting of that section. And Leslie Ann has joined us. Hi, Leslie Ann.
Hey, TJ. I'm gonna get all my stuff turned on here.
welcome. So I am glad you could come in and join us and give us an update of where you are and the process going forward.
Okay, so I'm not sure if you mentioned to everybody, but I've actually been out of the country taking care of some business and just returned. And so needing to pivot back into this whole space. But some of the things that we have in place are we're crafting it around the figures rather than the text to let the figures sort of drive the story, to set the stage for a lot of this. And so a lot of the figures that we're looking at are in terms of actual past climate, but also projected climate out into the future. And so we're wrapping up getting that part of this, the pieces together so we can draft the text to speak to the actual figures themselves. And so we had a wrap-up meeting this morning to bring some of those outlines into place. And we will be trying to make sure that we meet next week's deadline. So that's about where things stand for right now.
Great, thank you. Any questions for Leslie Ann? Thank you very much, Leslie Ann, and welcome back. I hadn't mentioned that previously, so.
Nope, that's
thank you.
perfectly fine.
Yeah.
Nice to be back. Thank you.
Okay, are there any other miscellaneous items that folks would like to bring up and discuss? Jane, go ahead. Oh, you're on mute still.
Just realized that, sorry. Just wanted to draw folks' attention that I was able to hear back from Liz, and I put in the chat the goals from the that will be included in the framework for measuring and assessing progress. And maybe just for the benefit of, I know Julie's on the phone, but just briefly, I'll just say that the goals relate to provide more real-time data on key implementation metrics than is currently feasible through the Vermont greenhouse gas inventory, while remaining aligned with said inventory over time where applicable. Create an infrastructure for sustained coordination on data sources across Vermont agencies and partners. Provide access to key data sources to organizations and members of the public engaged in climate action that wish to utilize Vermont's data to support their work. And 4, inform the general public about progress on achieving GWSA commitments, including emissions reduction, sequestration, adaptation, resilience, and equity targets. So they're pretty broad, and the devil will be in the details, but wanted to make sure that we accurately reflected those when we spoke about it earlier.
Thanks, Jane. Is that document in a format or ready to be sent out to the subcommittee?
No, but she just sent me the goals in an email, Liz, from the document, and she's refining the document. But if the goal will be to invite Liz to speak to the work of Cadmus and EFG to support this next week, then I'll work with her to speak to what the goals of that would be and make sure that she shares the memo ahead of them for you all to review after the meeting.
Great, thank you. The sun has come out. Jared.
I just wanted to provide a brief reminder for folks. I know a lot of folks on this call are regularly going to the Climate Council meetings, but for those who aren't, I do think that it's worth a reminder that next Tuesday's meeting will have a focus on the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee recommendations around the pollution reduction kind of pathways, strategies, and actions, including a summary of some of the modeling. So if you're one of the folks who only comes to certain council meetings, this may be one to prioritize if you are interested in the kind of results of the modeling and the cross-sector mitigation recommendations.
If you're
Thanks.
really into the modeling, I think that a more detailed presentation will be at cross sector tomorrow and not at the council. So folks. So.
Great. So with that, I think we've run the course of our agenda. Let's open the floor to public comment. Hi, George. Good afternoon.
Hi. Yep, the sun came out here too. Just a short statement, or I guess I would say formal request. We've heard an awful lot about the LEAP modeling, and I'm sure there's no shortage of complexity in the input parameters that were placed into those model runs. This might seem a bit dry, but I would like to acquire a copy of those configuration files, if that's feasible, and the resulting outputs. So I don't have enough familiarity with the LEAP tool to know if there's a single file that goes into it or whether it's a collection of files. In fact, in the ideal world, maybe those were even posted in a web page as part of the science data work products. But the goal would be to have the primary assumptions made for the sensitivity runs, and then those that were relied on to actually form our policies in each respective area or sector. I'm assuming that Comprehensive Energy Plan and Climate Action Plan are all using the same modeling, but if they weren't, to the extent they weren't, we would want to, I guess, in other words, basically a copy of all those results. And if it shows up as a lot of data that can't be done easily by email, I'm certainly receptive to working with you to get it posted at a data Dropbox and picking it up off the cloud. And then the computer scientist in me is going to dive into that and the output results from it, and basically just look for things that merit comment about assumptions, and perhaps comments on results that might be otherwise have been overlooked, perhaps showing up with areas for future work. I'd greatly appreciate it if you guys could do that. I know it's a big ask, but I think from a transparency perspective, it'd be the ideal.
Yeah, thanks, George, for that. I think that's one of the advantages of the LEAP model is that, you know, it is an open source model, actually, that you can download the kind of framework of it, you know, just the platform, if you will, and then insert the files to open a particular version of it and see everything. You need a license to change stuff, but that's, I think what you're asking for is like the transparency. And I think that's one of the, that's what I've been talking about anyway, as one of the benefits of the LEAP modeling. And so I appreciate that comment. And I think my expectation is that it will be available. We want to make sure it's right at the right time where the modeling, I don't want to put out like a ton of different iterations of it and have confusion caused because of that. And so, but we'll look into what the best time is and when we can put it out, if and then how to best get it out to you.
So would we circle back, say, at your next meeting to kind of clarify what that looks like?
We can get an update to see the progress of where we are in terms of when we think the timing is going to be. Yeah. Really put that down for an agenda item for an update for next week.
That'd be appreciated. Thank you.
Sorry, I was just making a note there. Steve, go ahead, please.
Hey, thanks a lot. I'll always enjoy your discussions. So thanks for all the great work you're doing. I want to make a couple of comments about your discussion about the impacts of doing the, the life cycle and or upstream or whatever, however you want to characterize it, for the energy, the emissions related to energy use in Vermont that happen out of state and some of them in state that are missed. And I think that I guess there are a few points that I'd like to make about that. The first one is that when you talk about how this changes the electric sector portion from, say, 2% to anything, you're really just talking about today. Remember, we're talking about electrification of transportation and thermal energy, and that 2% number, if whether it's right or wrong, that's going to be disappearing fast. The electric sector is going to be a much bigger portion of our emissions if we get rid of all the other emissions. So it's not just 2% to 2.25%. It would be, I don't know what the number is. It would be interesting to know what that number is, say 20, 30 years out when we do fully electrify. But that's certainly a much bigger percentage. And so, that certainly is in my mind when I think about this. It's not the 2% to 2.25% that really matters. A few other points. Sometimes when we talk about the impact of that assessment on, if we start assessing the impact of, the greenhouse gas impact from Hydro-Quebec, we sometimes talk in terms of that Hydro-Quebec electricity going away tomorrow or December 2nd or something. But really those contracts are locked in for another decade and a half. So that's not the result of redoing the assessment. Those are not going to change. And in a decade and a half, I think that it's fair to think about how there could easily be other technologies we don't have a clue about right now. And I think that we've already seen that in the last 5 years, how much has changed in terms of storage and even the technologies available for photovoltaics. It's a fast changing field. So, and with all the, in a sense, by being fair in the assessment, you actually push the technology, you push the development of other options and create new opportunities, which, that technology forcing aspect of regulation is really important here. So we shouldn't be thinking backwards. We should be thinking forward. Trying to put these in order here. A huge question about this is the renewable energy credits or environmental attributes that go along with this. And there are a couple of points to make about that. And there was some discussion about whether those are additionality, the idea that if they're additional, they're pushing the development of new technology, additional technology. And that is the theory, I think, with RECs, is that they push the development of new because they provide a funding source for new technology. But first of all, in the case of Hydro-Quebec, that pool of available untapped RECs is so vast that our purchase of those don't affect anything. So there's really no push. But if there were a push, what would it be pushing? It would be pushing expanded hydro projects. And Hydro-Quebec doesn't claim it has plans, but it certainly has plans to tap into Newfoundland and Labrador, which are expanding vastly, and they're just filling up a reservoir. They've got another one 4 or 5 times the size of that in the planning. So there's no question that they are at the margin of what they can export right now. And as they expand their exports, it is all about additionality. And what that means, and I think you have to look at the marginal sources when you do these assessments. If we're pushing new sources, those are the worst, right? Those are in the short term the worst carbon emitters of the whole set. So as bad as coal, and Hydro-Quebec would acknowledge that those the first 10, 20 years are when you get the most emissions from those reservoirs. So that's the other aspect of RECs. When you talk about, the RECs are about, between the power and the RECs, that's roughly 50%. I'm pretty sure it's higher than 50% now of our electricity use in Vermont. And if we're going from zero carbon emissions as we measure it now in the inventory to whether it's the conservative estimates from the Hydro-Quebec sponsored research or independent research, it is much greater and maybe 2 to 5 or 6 times the numbers I think Jared has used in his assessment. So there's I think you got to look at that. That's half of our electricity use that should be, looked at very carefully with that. Let me see. And then the one other thing that I mentioned about all that is that it's not just Hydro-Quebec and nuclear, as Jared mentioned. There's also biomass and absolutely natural gas. So these are all, there are pieces of this that are not counted. The biomass is counted as 0, and we know it's not. The biomass electricity is what I'm referring to. And natural gas is huge. That would apply not just to the heating, which is would make a big difference in priorities, like which part of the thermal sector do we address first. It also reflects a lot of electricity use. And that's really about that electricity we get from the regional grid. And that's really important. And, natural gas, I mean, it does matter. This other question that goes with that is whether you take the 20-year numbers or the 100-year numbers for natural gas. The biggest, we're in that hazard crisis point with the planet where we really have to look at the shorter term impacts, the 10 to 20-year impacts. And that's huge. So when you incorporate, and I guess one thing I mentioned is, when we use those RECs, unbundled attributes from Hydro-Quebec, we are not actually changing where we get our electricity, right? We're not changing electricity at all. And so that still means we're getting a lot of those RECs, we're still emitting those emissions from natural gas off the regional grid when we purchase those RECs in many cases. I mean, it's a big variety, but so if you incorporate all of that, I'm pretty sure that the number goes, instead of from 2% to 2.25% to some other larger number. And I wouldn't be surprised if it's from 2% to 3% currently. But again, when you look at the long-term 10 or 20 or 30 years out as we electrify everything, that is a major impediment to reaching our greenhouse gas goals of, ultimately net zero. So sorry for the long series of points here, but I think that there's a lot in that, and to just simplify it and talk about, as I heard today, I hope that you realize that all those other pieces are part of the same puzzle. So thank you for accommodating my comments.
Steve, Jared, it looked like you wanted to comment.
Yeah, if it's okay, I just wanted to offer one follow-up. And first, thank you, Steve, for your comments. I really appreciate the focus and clarity of them. One thing I just want to say that as we look ahead to the results of an RFI on upstream and life cycle analysis, correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, but I think I heard you say something like, when we do that for Hydro-Quebec, of course, that value may go from 0 to 50 pounds per megawatt hour, 200 pounds per megawatt hour. It's going to depend on what peer-reviewed studies we use and which we think are most appropriate. I don't think that immediately means that our electricity sector as a proportion of our overall emissions increases, because I think it's important to remember that we're also going to be assigning upstream and life cycle emissions factors to the energy sources. And I think it is very likely that the increase in upstream and life cycle emissions that we see from certainly natural gas, but also related to propane and fuel oil in the thermal sector, and gasoline and diesel in the transportation sector, and those fossil emissions that are the marginal emitting units of the ISO New England grid mix, which is where most of our electricity sector emissions come from as counted by DEC currently, those are all also going to increase. And so, as a share, we might not see, an increase in electricity, because we're also going to be seeing increase, like the overall number across the board for energy sector emissions would be going up under that scenario. And even if, electricity resources from Hydro-Quebec are going up, I have not seen any analysis that would suggest they would ever go up to a degree that would more than offset the emissions reduction benefit of electrifying the most emitting sources, which are the fossil fuels used for how we get around and heat our homes. So I think you're right that the shares could shift over time as we electrify. Clearly, if we electrify the transportation and thermal sectors, those sectors' share of the overall emissions will hopefully go down, and electricity may increase. But you can have that happening while significantly reducing overall emissions because of both the improved efficiency of electric technology, just using a lot less energy up front, like electric vehicles and heat pumps do compared to combustion technologies, but also benefiting from a less carbon intensive, no matter how you measure it, fuel source in our electricity portfolio versus the direct fossil fuel use that we currently have for vehicles and heating systems. So all that is just to say, I want to hope that we keep this in that bigger picture, and it'll be really important to look at the results of that RFI comprehensively, transparently, very carefully.
Yeah, if I could respond briefly to that, TJ. I agree with a lot of what you just said. And certainly all those other areas would go up at first also. But keep in mind that it also means that when we take action to reduce vehicle emissions, get out of our cars or go to electric, that reduces much more quickly, right? I mean, that whatever we increased it by, that goes with the reductions as well. So it doesn't, when you, maybe what I'm talking about is the sectorial split here, those, with the exception of how we look at, let's say, a focus on natural gas sources for reduction in the thermal sector. That's a possibility. I don't have a plan for that, but it makes that pretty important, more important than it is now even. And I don't think it changes much in how you approach transportation because of that, whatever increases you get right back out of your reduction efforts. But I think it does change when you start looking at these sectors where we now count something as zero, and it's real. It's I think that makes a big change, and I also think that when you stretch it out and look at these numbers as they work in the future, we're not talking about 2% anymore. We're talking about electricity being 60% or 80% of our emissions, and in that case, those lingering emissions that we have ignored so far would play a much bigger role in our overall mix. So that's the framework, and I think my sense of how these things work is that you don't come along in 10 years and rethink the system. I think you're building the system now. You're making the transition now to the new, we're moving. The Global Warming Solutions Act doesn't talk about renewable energy at all. Just the word renewable isn't in the act, but we're talking about greenhouse gas reductions. So to substitute, for example, to equate a renewable energy credit with something to do with greenhouse gases is not real. You're inventing something that's not in the act, and it's not part of what the law requires. So you almost have to, and it changes the picture, and this is the time to make the change. I guess that's the main point I would make, as opposed to trying to fix it later. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Always appreciate the comments. Thank you, George, and other members of the family. Really appreciate your attendance and your attention to the details and the conversations that we're having. It's always great. So thank you very much. And thank you to the whole committee. As we saw in a few people's Hollywood squares here, the sun has come out. And so everybody please enjoy the rest of the afternoon. We are adjourned.
Thanks, TJ.
Thanks,
Thanks,
TJ.
everyone.
Thanks, everyone.